Welcome back to This Is Your Country with Paige. As many of you know, one of my favorite topics to explore on the show is globalization and its consequences for the American people, the policies that got us here and how we can fix the dysfunction. The consequences of offshoring, the consequences of losing our competitive edge in manufacturing and in industry. And today I am so delighted to welcome our first guest ever, Mr. Clyde Prestowitz, who is an expert in globalization and trade, and he was an advisor to Presidents Reagan, H.W. Bush, Clinton, and Obama, serving as a voice for the American people and for increased American competitiveness over many, many years. In the course of studying globalization and the policies that have weakened our country, I came across this book, The Betrayal of American Prosperity by Clyde Prestowitz, and I thought I have to have him on the show. And to my great delight, he agreed to come on, and I hope you enjoy our interview. I am thrilled to welcome to This Is Your Country my first ever guest, Mr. Clyde Prestowitz, who is an expert on trade policy and American competitiveness and the policies and consequences of globalization. And by way of introduction, the New York Times has called Clyde Prestowitz one of the most far-seeing forecasters of global trends. For more than 50 years, Prestowitz has studied, lived, and worked in Asia, Europe, and Latin America, as well as in the United States, and has become noted as a leading writer and strategist on globalization and competitiveness. His best-selling books include Trading Places, Rogue Nation, 3 Billion New Capitalists, The Betrayal of American Prosperity, and Japan Restored. Prestowitz was a leader of the first U.S. trade mission to China in 1982 and has served as an advisor to Presidents Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Clinton, and Obama. He has worked closely with CEOs such as Intel's Andy Grove, Chrysler's Lee Iacocca, and Fred Smith of FedEx. As counselor to the Secretary of Commerce in the Reagan administration, Mr. Prestowitz headed negotiations with Japan, South Korea, and China. Under the Clinton administration, he served as vice chairman of the Presidential Commission on Trade and Investment in the Asia-Pacific region. He was also on the board of advisors to the Export-Import Bank. Clyde, thank you so much for joining the show today. I'm delighted to have you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So the reason that I wanted to have you on as the first guest for This Is Your Country is because I was just reading your book, The Betrayal of American Prosperity. And I heard
it's a good book.
I would certainly say so. And I want to, as a note to readers, just mention that this is a book that I think many Americans should be familiar with, that they should read. It is so full of interesting information and important history, documentation of the policies that got us to where we are. I cannot recommend it enough. So I want to get right into it, get to your expertise, share your perspective with our audience. So let's get into it. Your experience in government. You advised a number of presidents, as per your bio that I just shared, and you served as a trade negotiator, a trade negotiator dealing with America's competitors, including China, Japan, and South Korea. What were the top considerations influencing trade policy in Washington at these different points in time?
Well, there were two major considerations. One was geopolitical. So in the wake of World War II, of course, America was far and away the world's most powerful country. And we our presidents, all the presidents with whom I worked, tended to emphasize geopolitical issues over trade and economic issues. The best example I can give you is in the mid 1980s. Ronald Reagan was president. I was in the Reagan administration, and we were negotiating with the Japanese over semiconductors, steel, automobiles, machine tools, a whole range of products. Our trade deficit with Japan grew from about $20 billion a year in 1980 to about $60 billion by 1985. The Japanese semiconductor industry was making huge inroads into the global and the American semiconductor market. And we had extensive negotiations with the Japanese over their market and industrial policy practices. So in Japan, the government had issued a Buy Japan order. the minister of the Ministry of International Trade and Industry had sent a letter to virtually all of the top CEOs in Japan, directing them that wherever possible they should buy Japanese made semiconductors. At the same time, Japanese companies were selling freely semiconductors in the US market. The US president was not telling American semiconductor buyers to buy American. And the Japanese semiconductor companies were colluding among themselves in terms of their pricing of semiconductors in the US market. And so I and some others were charged with negotiating a more open Japanese market. We went through years of negotiation, and finally we got to a moment in which President Reagan went to Japan, had a meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister, and when he turned to then Vice President George H.W. Bush, and he said to Bush, George, would you follow up? And so Bush became the head of a task force to follow up on Reagan's issues with Japan, but particularly on this trade issue. I was on the task force. So we had, at the initial task force meeting, we kind of established the ground rules that we, the task force, would operate by. And we said, look, uh, typically these negotiations wind up with some kind of an announcement of an agreement. And if there's an agreement, then Vice President Bush, who is the head of the task force, would normally go to Japan to celebrate this agreement. So we all agreed amongst ourselves. So I was there from the Commerce Department. We had other people, State Department, Defense Department, Treasury Department. We all agreed that if we did not get what we were asking for, Bush would not go to Tokyo. So we negotiated. We did not get what we were asking for. Came time to decide whether Bush should go to Tokyo or not. I'll never forget this meeting. It was in the executive office building across from the White House. All the top people were there, uh, and, uh, and I argued that look, we didn't get what we wanted. We all agreed Bush wouldn't go if we didn't get a satisfactory agreement. And at that moment, the representative from the National Security Council uh, pounded his hand on the arms of his chair, and he said, "We must have those bases." And so what he was saying was that our mutual security agreement with Japan, which uh, put Okinawa and other bases in Japan in U.S. hands, that maintaining those our use of those bases was more important than the issues that we have been negotiating, particularly semiconductors, during our talks. Now, to me, at that moment, that was a revelation, but it was a crazy revelation. There was no threat to those bases. Nobody was going to take those bases away. Japanese were not threatening to withdraw use of the bases. But it was in the head. It was in the head of the key guy of the National Security Council and the State Department and the Defense Department that was the main element of our relationship with Japan. So
Hmm.
the result was that Bush went to Japan, declared victory. We didn't have a victory. Uh, we continued to lose market share in the semiconductor market. So, U.S. policy, trade policy, I would say from the end of World War II until Trump, Republican and Democrat, didn't matter which party, was dominated by geopolitical considerations rather than trade and economic considerations. So, first point. Second point, um, for most of America's history, our country followed a policy that would be described as mercantilist and protectionist. In the War of 1812, which we almost lost, after that war, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton agreed that the U.S. would have to become more of a manufacturing country. We almost lost the war because we couldn't make weapons that we needed to fight the war. So Hamilton and Jefferson agreed, okay, we are going to become a manufacturing country. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to have an American plan. And the plan is, first of all, we're going to impose tariffs. We're going to raise tariffs on imports from abroad in order to make it more attractive for Americans to produce in America. And the second thing we're going to do is we're going to provide government support for development of things like canals, telegraph, uh, um, merchant marine, uh, settlement of the West. Uh, we're going to then through the years, in the middle of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln raised tariffs sky high on steel. He was criticized. Many economists said, "Oh my God, steel prices will go so high, and it'll cost us a lot more. We should import from England, which at that time England was the low cost steel producer in the world." And Lincoln made this interesting comment. He said, "I don't know much about tariffs, but he said I know that if we get the steel from England, we'll get the steel, and England will get the money. If we buy the steel in America, we'll get the steel and we'll get the money." Uh, and as a result of that, by 1900, turn of the century, the United States was the low cost steel producer, not England. Uh, I could go on and on, but let's take just one industry that is right at the forefront right now: semiconductors. So in the early 1980s, the U.S. was the world's leading semiconductor maker. And as I said, the Japanese got into the business and they began to become very competitive and to gain a high market share. Eventually, although the Bush mission did not get what it wanted, eventually the U.S. government, uh, under under now President George H.W. Bush, uh, negotiated an agreement with Japan under which the Japanese companies were uh, what we call anti-dumping duty, essentially tariffs, were imposed on imports of Japanese semiconductors, and the Japanese government undertook to do its best to assure that American producers would have 25% share of the Japanese market. So this is called mercantilism, protectionism, and that was American policy from 1816 until 1948. After World War II, American policy changed dramatically. We adopted what we called free trade, globalization, and free trade. And our economists, our university professors, and large segments of our business establishment became disciples, not just disciples, I would say missionaries for free trade. And because the U.S. was a big economy, and because we, in the wake of World War II, we accounted for about half of global production all by ourselves, uh, there was quite a lot of room for the U.S. to be liberal and to open its market, even if other countries didn't open their markets. Um, but the idea of free trade became a kind of a religion. Uh, and uh, and then we got into the 1990s, and there was a policy, a philosophy that through free trade we would have peace and democratization globally. Particularly, this applied to China. And so Presidents Bush, H.W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, President Clinton, uh, President W. Bush, all of them strove to open our market to China, to urge American companies to invest in China, to get China into as a member of the World Trade Organization. Bob Zoellick, who was U.S. Trade Representative in the George W. Bush administration, famously said that America wants China to be a responsible stakeholder in the liberal, rules based global order. And I was on the first U.S. trade mission to China. I was involved in a lot of the discussions with China. And there was a faith, almost a religious faith, that through, in fact, George W. Bush made the statement that free trade inevitably plants the seeds of democracy. And so the thought was that the faith was that we just open our market and we do engage in free trade with China, encourage our companies to invest in China, move their production to China from America to China, that China will not only become a market economy, but it will become a freer society, maybe even a democracy. Those two elements are the keys to our economic policies over the past 50, 60 years.
That's right. And that's an excellent walk through a number of anecdotes that have actually still borne fruit to this day, including the semiconductor issue. You know, to reference or to paraphrase your Abraham Lincoln quote, now we don't have the semiconductors and we don't have the money. We've, bartered away all of this advantage. And so, so many questions based on what you just said. One would be, in addition to this, the intensity of the ideology of free trade, globalization, that you noted in your book was coming after World War II from a group of economists, professors, academics, and so on that obviously came to enrapture the politicians in Washington, D.C., but also a lot of corporate entities. And so I wondered, from your experience, ranging from the White House to, eventually being in the private sector, a commentator or someone studying this, what can you please speak to the corporate interests that were driving elements of this from the 80s onward?
Right. Well, I think it's very good questions, a couple of points. The generation of CEOs, corporate leaders of World War II, of the Korean War, um, were a generation of leaders who, because they had been through World War II, they had been through the Korean War, even the Vietnam War, they had a strong sense of being American corporations, of their own corporations being important pillars of the American system, of America's prosperity. And they had a sense of what I would call being a part of a team or being a leader of a team. Tom McCabe was the great builder of Scott Paper Company, was a friend of mine, and he had on his wall of his office, he had the requirements or the job of a CEO, and it started with make the best product, be quality of product, and then second was be sure your workers are well trained and well taken care of, and then the third was take care of the environment and the neighborhoods in which your company operates. And then four was take care of the environment and the well-being of the United States. And then last was, oh yeah, the shareholders, keep the shareholders happy. Uh, and one major thing that changed was that in the late 1960s, that attitude of being part of the team or being part of the country shifted. Um, Professor Friedman from Chicago um, wrote a famous book in which he said the job of the CEO is to make more money for shareholders. That's it. CEO doesn't have to worry about anything else, just make money for shareholders. This business roundtable, which had a kind of a code for the CEO in the early 1990s, it changed the code. The business roundtable changed the code. Basically, the new code was shareholders, just optimized for shareholders. Forget about the rest of that stuff. So there in the last 50 years, there's been a major shift in what business schools teach to how CEOs and companies should operate. Huge shift in the attitudes, the expectations, the pressures of Wall Street. Um, if your main job is to increase uh, profitability, and if Wall Street is watching you every 3 months and grading you, there's a push toward a focus on short-term profit, uh, and also because CEOs increasingly are not necessarily the founders of their companies. Uh, Often CEOs are going to be CEO for 5 to 10 years. So within that 5 to 10 years, that's the time they have to make their money, their own personal money, and they get stock options. Uh, they have the option to buy the stock of their own company or have the company buy its own shares. So it's a short-term focus. All the pressure is on a CEO to focus on short-term profitability. And then I would say that um, a second important aspect of this has been that the um, the corporate leaders have become globalized, but they've become globalized in a strange way. Um, if I take a guy like Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, when he testifies before Congress, he inevitably will describe himself as an American CEO. But everything that Apple sells is made in China. And Tim Apple has special agreements with China on, and they get support from China, subsidies and capital support from China. Uh, in Washington, Tim Cook is a powerful guy. Uh, he has instant entree. He could call the president, anyone in Congress, and they'll take his call. Uh, Apple spends, I don't know exactly how much, but hundreds of millions of dollars on political donations and policy issues. Uh, Apple can challenge the U.S. government. In fact, in 2015, there was a murder in Bakersfield, California, and the murderer dropped an iPhone. The FBI wanted to open the iPhone. Apple refused to help. Um, Eventually, the FBI went to court. In the meantime, the FBI found somebody who could open the phone, so the court case was dropped. But Apple did not cooperate with the U.S. government and didn't have any punishment for not cooperating with the U.S. government. It hired lawyers. It beat the U.S. government in court. Fast forward to 2019. Kids are demonstrating in Hong Kong. And there's an app in the Apple App Store called Hong Kong Map Live, which enables an app user to see Hong Kong in real time. So the kids, the demonstrators, were using the app and they were saying, the police are over here. We'll demonstrate over here. This was driving Beijing crazy. And the word got to Tim Cook, get that app out of the App Store. And it was out within 2 days.
Wow.
So in Washington, Tim is powerful. In Beijing, he's on his knees. And it's not just Tim. It's all the other major foreign CEOs who have big commitments in China. China has no rule of law. They're not going to argue. They're not going to go to court against Xi Jinping. They're not going to argue with the Chinese government. So in effect, these corporations have become hostages. We call them American companies. They're not. They're Chinese companies. And that's a very subtle but powerful factor that has come to play in the last 20 years.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that because I'd like you to talk more about that in the context of offshoring manufacturing. And I'm just going to read a very quick anecdote from your book where you write, In 2004, Council of Economic Advisors Chairman Greg Mankiw stated in the annual economic report of the president that offshoring was good for the U.S. economy and no different in its economic effect than similar activities done domestically, like having a lawn service cut your grass instead of doing it yourself. Though Mankiw's argument ignited a firestorm of debate, the economics establishment strenuously defended his conclusions. Particularly influential was a study by the McKinsey Global Institute that showed a benefit to the U.S. economy of $1.12 to $1.14 for every dollar of offshore spending. The main problem with this analysis was that based on surveys from the late 1990s at the peak of the dot-com bubble, it presumed 69% of workers whose jobs were transferred abroad would find re-employment at 96.5% of their previous wage. But the U.S. Census Bureau reported that on average, in normal years, 52% of job losers who are eventually reemployed take a substantial pay cut. Indeed, McKinsey itself had done another study in 2003, which showed that only 36% of those displaced got new jobs at equal pay, while 25% took pay cuts as much as 30%. So if McKinsey had applied the results of its own earlier study to its offshoring analysis, there would have been a big loss for the U.S. economy instead of a gain. So the reason I quote your book on this is simply because it seems that there were a lot of interests lining up to justify these very counterintuitive, almost transparently destructive policies of offshoring and so on. So I wondered if you could talk a little more about the debate about offshoring at the time, as well as the ripple effects of what happens to a country's economy when you lose that know-how and so on.
Yeah, sure. The real shame is that there wasn't a debate. The economics establishment managed to convince itself that offshoring of production would be a positive for the U.S. economy. So the idea was that products that we make that are labor intensive, of course, we have high wages. And so if we move the production of them to China or Vietnam or some other similar location, the cost of producing them will be less, and they'll be exported back to the U.S., and consumers will pay lower prices. Inflation will be kept under control. And then if somebody like me raised his hand and said, yeah, but what about the workers who lose their jobs? The answer always, they'll get another job at roughly the same wage. And various studies were done to try to prove that workers would not be harmed by that. Some economists have done this analysis of looking at what happens to workers who lose their jobs. And it turns out that they don't get new jobs readily. And if they do get new jobs, they get paid a lot less than they were getting paid in their old jobs.
A couple other questions, since you have been studying this debate for so long. My question is, as you know, the government has, many, if not dozens, of agencies dedicated to the collecting of data about the economy. They study, what's happening to workers, wages, prices, and so on, capacity of industrial capacity and so on. And so I wonder, when you look at these graphs of all of these different economic indicators, after we pursued the policy of having China join the WTO, normalizing trade relations with China, which is an incredibly favorable thing to do, treating their markets so favorably and allowing them to sell in ours so favorably, you can see these trend lines, tank almost immediately for workers, prosperity, all these kinds of things that you would normally use as indicators of the health of a nation's economy. And so I just wonder, why did, what they're teaching in economics PhD programs, in MBA programs, and all of these people who have influence over the government, why wasn't the conventional wisdom, adapting to that?
It was a religion. Globalization and free trade became a kind of a religion. So you have to go back to the 1930s, the Great Depression. Many economists argued that the Great Depression was triggered by the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. In 1930, Senator Smoot and Hawley passed a tariff level that was higher than the U.S. had ever had. And almost as soon as they passed the tariff, the Depression kicked in. Many economists blamed the tariffs for the Depression, and because in Europe the Depression contributed to the outbreak of the war, they said that the Smoot-Hawley tariff not only caused the Depression, it caused the war. And hence, in the post-war period, there was this great drive not to have tariffs, but to have open, free trade, so we wouldn't have any more depressions or have any more wars. Now, the truth of the matter is that a number of analyses have demonstrated that the Smoot-Hawley tariff had, if it, its effect on the United States was slightly positive, and its effect on the global economy was slightly negative. But by no means was it the cause of the Depression or the war. But it was presented that way. I mean, when I was in college, since we both went to the same college, I bet you were taught the same thing, that the Smoot-Hawley tariff was a terrible thing that caused the Depression and contributed to the war. And that became holy doctrine for a long time, that open trade was just a good thing. And as I said, we for a long time linked it to our geopolitical policies, thinking that open trade would strengthen our geopolitical position. Now it's changing now, and it's changing, one, because a lot of that early analysis was wrong. But interestingly to me, in the last couple of years, we've seen the global supply chain kind of fall apart, not work. And what that's telling us is that the economists and the CEOs who argued for this global supply chain and who ran econometric models to prove that it was more efficient, that they missed something. They missed the potential cost of a collapse of part of the supply chain. And so when you had a COVID, suddenly all the assumptions that the supply chain were built on didn't hold. Now, that cost was never included in the assumptions of the econometric models that were used to justify the policy. A second important point. Shipping by airplanes and ships account for about 15% of greenhouse gases annually. The cost of that global warming is not included in any of the calculations. So let's take something like steel. China has been selling steel at very low prices around the world. They have been effectively dumping steel, selling it below the cost of production in many cases. And economists have argued, wow, these Chinese, good. They have cheap steel, and that means that builders in America get cheap steel and build buildings at lower costs and so forth. But no one ever included in the cost of the carbon. So China makes its steel largely with coal-fired energy. Steel in the U.S. is made more frequently with gas-fired energy. Gas-fired energy is much less carbon intensive than coal-fired. So that should give the U.S. producers an economic step up, but it doesn't, because nobody includes the cost of the energy. Then you ship the Chinese steel from China to the U.S. or Europe, wherever it goes, and that's putting more greenhouse gases up in the air. But there's no charge attached to that. So if you actually did this thing accurately, there would be far less export from China and far more domestic production. But our economists, all these bright guys who got Nobel Prizes, they didn't think about that.
Well, speaking of the sort of broken orthodoxy and these mistaken assumptions, one piece of conventional wisdom that I hear pushed very often by academic economists holds that trade deficits are not harmful because US consumers are buying things they want, and basically trade activity has been completely optimized. And one of the most striking parts of your book is that you address the ways in which large trade deficits weaken our nation from a financial standpoint and have implications for the dollar and debt and so on. So could you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. You're right. Economists tend to argue that trade deficits don't matter. But effectively, what it means is that the United States, with its large and continuing trade deficits, is selling the farm. So when we, if you have a bilateral trade deficit, let's suppose we have a trade deficit with Mexico, uh, but we have a trade surplus with Canada, let's say, and maybe they offset. That's fine, no problem. But if you have a trade deficit with everybody, which is pretty much what we have, what happens is that you're buying more than you're making, and so how do you, if you're spending more than you're making, how do you do that? Well, you borrow money, and as when a nation borrows money, what happens is that um, Chinese or Japanese or German or whoever, they have surpluses. So we'll be paying dollars to them, and they'll have a lot of dollars. And in order to buy their stuff, effectively we need to borrow money, and so we borrow money from them. Now we don't. It's not like going to the bank, but what we do is we will sell U.S. Treasury bonds. So we'll print some bonds and then we'll sell U.S. Treasury bonds to the Germans, and they'll pay dollars for these bonds. But that bond is a loan. It's a loan. We pay interest on that bond, uh, and uh, or maybe a German company will have a lot of dollars because it's selling a lot to America, and it will maybe come to America and buy an office building. Uh, and so it's lending money. It's basically to the American economy. It's buying an office building, and that office building, you know, it has to pay taxes, and it has to upkeep has to be paid, and so forth. And so that's all like an interest being paid to the German owner of the office building. So effectively, what we're doing is we keep selling off pieces of our farm in order to finance our excess consumption. And if you look at it day by day, it looks small. You don't feel the impact. But if you look at it over a period of time, I can take you back to 1980. And at that time, American investors had overseas holdings greater than foreign investors had in the US. So, what that meant was that on a comparative basis, Americans were earning interest or dividends from the totality of their foreign overseas operations. Today, it's exactly the reverse. We're paying every year a tax or a return abroad greater than we're receiving.
Hmm.
Now, if you have a big estate, you can sell off little plots for a long time, but eventually you get to the main house, and we're getting closer and closer to the main house.
Yes, and that's a really good analogy. I think one reason I'm interested in this specifically is because when I was in the Trump White House, there were still, I felt that the president was elected with a mandate to address trade imbalances and to address the weaker position that puts our country in, decreased competitiveness, and so on. Yet we had a number of internal advisors working against that, largely whose backgrounds were from Wall Street, think tanks, academia, consulting companies, and so on. And I wondered, at the time in the 90s when NAFTA was being debated, that was by no means a foregone conclusion. There was huge uproar from people representing labor, from people representing lots of different areas of the country that figured that would spell doom for them. And I wondered, since you had a front row seat to a lot of these debates at the time, did you witness a specific sort of jockeying for people to consider these different considerations, people worried about the political impact, or just how did those concerns enter into the conversation at all?
Yeah, no, there was enormous debate. Essentially, it was a debate between labor and management. So, if I take the auto industry, for example, all of the U.S. auto companies desperately wanted NAFTA. They wanted to move their production to Mexico, which they thought, because Mexican labor is very inexpensive, they thought that by producing in Mexico would enable them better to compete with the Japanese, who were exporting cars into the U.S. market from Japan. So the Business Roundtable,
the Chamber of Commerce,
yeah, all the business people were fighting tooth and nail to get NAFTA done, and the economists were also on the NAFTA side. Ross Perot famously talked about the great sucking sound. And the economists all argued, no, there's not going to be any sucking sound, no siree, Bob. This is going to create jobs. It's not going to take jobs away. That was the professional economist argument. Labor, on the other hand, the U.S. Auto Union, Steel Union, all the union guys understood that there would be a sucking sound, and they didn't want to get sucked out, and so they opposed. The president had this was probably the single biggest lobbying event that I witnessed in my career. But every morning, the business team and the administration would get together and plot strategy and go out and call on congressmen and write op-eds and so forth. And every morning, the labor guys would get together to try to offset that. And of course, the business and the economic argument won. But interestingly, Ross Perot turned out to be right. NAFTA did not create jobs in America. And recently, a friend of mine, a guy named Jeff Ferry, who is chief economist for the Coalition for a Prosperous America, received an award from the National Association of Business Economists for demonstrating that the econometric models that had been used by the administration and by the pro-NAFTA lobbying team were wrong. That they had just been flat out wrong. And Jeff proved it, but he proved it 20 years too late.
My goodness. Well, again, it just makes you wonder what people were thinking when you had a policy deliberately advocated by people whose interest is to save money on labor costs. What exactly do you think is in it for them? Right. Reducing labor costs. So,
one argument that was made was that if we move, let's take the auto industry. If we move the auto industry assembly, let's say, to Mexico, of course, Mexican labor is much cheaper, but the parts will come from America. And we'll be able to compete better against the Japanese. So we'll make more parts, and they'll have them assembled in Mexico. Now, as it turned out, production of parts also began to move to Mexico.
Exactly. So, just a couple more questions here. I want to be respectful of your time. And the one phenomenon that you've already addressed a little bit is this notion of companies with no country, companies that feel they don't owe something to the United States, that it's merely a place where they do some business. And you actually wrote a more recent op-ed where you referenced Intel delivering this sort of groveling apology to China after this sort of orchestrated campaign on social media sites in the wake of Intel criticizing the Chinese labor camps. And they said, we're so sorry, whatever. And you wrote in your book that at times CEOs end up functioning as emissaries for foreign governments when they want to protect that market access or other business considerations. And so what can we do to compel American business leaders to recouple with the national interest?
So I think that this is a really important issue. On the one hand, I think that there needs to be stronger regulation of corporate political donations. Uh, I, I don't think that major corporations should have the power that they have today to influence political decision making. Uh, one point that I've made a lot, it's in a way it's a small point, but I think it could be quite powerful. I mentioned earlier Tim Cook, CEO of Apple. Tim testifies, and other CEOs testify before the U.S. Congress frequently. When they testify, they present themselves as the voice of American business. We have a Foreign Agent Registration Act. So if a person in Washington, this often often there are lawyers in Washington who are representing foreign interests. When they testify before Congress, they are required to declare that they are representing foreign interests. I think Tim Cook should be required to declare that he's representing a foreign interest. And the same for Fred Smith and others who have big business in China, who are subject to Chinese pressure and coercion. They at least should have to admit that they're subject to that coercion. But I also think that we have to keep in mind that corporations do not charter themselves. If you ask the question, where does a corporation come from? You and I can't just say, oh, this be a corporation. If you and I want to form a corporation, we have to go to one of the states. Typically, it's the state of Delaware, but other states can charter you. But you have to apply. You have to go to the state and you have to say, Paige and I are going to set up the Paige Clyde company, and here's what we're investing, and then the state will issue a charter, and the charter has requirements in it. In order to be licensed, you have to meet the requirements of the state. Now, one thing that the state does if you and I set up a new corporation, the state gives us an enormous gift. It's the gift of limited liability. By being incorporated, if our project goes bankrupt, the shareholders who lost money can't take our house or our car or throw us in jail. That's limited liability. That's a huge gift. The state gives that gift because it expects the corporation to do something good for the people of the state. That idea has been lost. And we need to kind of reinforce uh, publicly the notion that the state, the government charters the corporation to do good things for the people. Its main job is really not to make money for the shareholders. It's to do good things for the people. And if that makes money for the shareholder, great. But it has a larger obligation.
That's right.
And I think that gets forgotten. It should be reinforced. And a way to do that is through the tax system, where you impose penalties on corporations that act in ways that are contrary to the public interest. I mean, if we have criminals who act in contrary to the public interest, we put them in jail, right? So maybe we should put a few CEOs in jail. I'm kidding, but you get the idea.
I understand. Yes. I think, well, and the other reason I was asking about the economic analysis, the people influencing decision makers, not just in the private sector, but the people in government who are responsible for making policy. I don't like to lay too much blame at the feet of corporations, even though I do think they deserve a lot of blame and a lot of scrutiny, because there are the people who are creating the laws and regulations, creating the infrastructure in which these people are operating when they run their companies, when they do this offshoring, when they do lots of things that compromise the national interest. Who is ultimately responsible for making the policy that sets up that scaffolding? Right. Obviously, our elected leaders. So just to wrap up, my final question is, could we revive the American system now? And obviously we had the CHIPS Act. I think I'm a little lukewarm on the CHIPS Act. I think that's not, it's a marginally promising start, but it seems like a mere shadow of America's historical efforts to fundamentally change our economy, take advantage of economies of scale, overtake our competitors. And I just worry sometimes we see so much spending with so little return. And is there a way to become a miracle economy once again? And if you were advising a president in a position to make some of these policies, where would you even start?
Yeah. So I think it's very possible. Despite all of the mistakes and all the problems, we remain a rich country, and we have a lot of talent. I think that one of the things that has to be done is a much greater sense of community responsibility. So, and let me start with taxes. When I was growing up in the 1950s, I was one of 6 children, 8 people in my family. We had one income. My dad worked for a medium-sized company as an engineer. He never made more than $25,000 a year. All the kids went to college. All the kids went to grad school. We lived in a working class neighborhood. And today, that is really not possible. And why was it possible then and not possible now? Because in those days, we taxed rich people. The tax system in the 1950s and 1960s had been built in the great Great Depression and during the war, and we had a much smaller gap between rich and poor. We need to work on that. We need to have the top 10% need to be in my view, need to be paying a lot more than they're paying. Second thing that I think needs to be done is there has to be a focus on making it in America. All these costs that we mentioned that are not incorporated in the calculations need to be incorporated. There needs to be a focus on making things in America, because when you make things, you create skills. A big loss that we've suffered that nobody's ever counted is the loss of skills. We need to get skills back, and that comes with making stuff in America. And to do that, we have a great example, China. China in the last 25 years has gone from a country that made nothing to a country that makes everything. And they started with a lot less capital and talent than we have. So we should be able to do that. But to your point, we have a Commerce Department. The Commerce Department has been playing a critical role in this CHIPS Act, which is going to put some money into the semiconductor industry. But there's nobody at Commerce who is analyzing what should we be doing in machine tools, what should we be doing in in advanced materials? What should we be doing in telecommunications? There's no overall analysis or plan or thinking about anticipating the future. So China's Vision 2025 has already established essentially a blueprint for us. China's identified all the key industries. They have analyzed the investment they have to make, the skills they have to create, and they're pushing to make all that stuff in China. Uh, if I were Secretary Raimondo of the Commerce Department, I'd get a copy of the Chinese plan and, fiddle a little bit with it to Americanize it and introduce it. I think the first step has been this thing with semiconductor, the CHIPS Act for the semiconductor industry, and we just need to do the similar kind of planning and thinking for other key industries.
It's funny you say that we should look to how the Chinese have explicitly, written out what industries they want to be competitive in and how they intend to get there. Because I do suspect that they had their sociologists and economists study how we became such a powerhouse, probably in the 1800s. What the
Chinese did was they looked at us, but what they really did was they very carefully studied Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. The Japanese miracle, the tigers, they studied that very, very carefully, and have essentially done the same thing that those countries did. And China being a much bigger country, it's having even a bigger impact than the Japanese had back in the 70s and 80s.
Right. Well, when it comes to restoring American prosperity and competitiveness, I'm afraid I don't exactly agree with you about raising taxes, solving the problem of stagnant labor incomes and other things. I think my preferred intervention there would be ceasing the flow of cheap foreign labor, undercutting wages here and so on. That would probably be my first go-to, which they don't let Bernie Sanders say anymore, but he used to. So anyway, I think that wraps it up. Thank you so much for joining us. As I say, I cannot recommend enough your book, The Betrayal of American Prosperity, to our listeners, and so grateful for your perspective and your knowledge on this. Thank you, Clyde.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you despite all of our technical difficulties. Appreciate it. Thank you.
No, it's been wonderful. Thank you for your time. See you next time.
Bye-bye. Okay.
This is the first in a series of interviews that I will do with policy experts who break from the traditional Washington orthodoxy and who offer a variety of solutions that we can consider to revive our country and make it great once again. Thank you so much for listening to This Is Your Country with Paige Willie.